Hi, everybody. I'm Jorge Guzman. I teach a class here at Columbia Business School called Entrepreneurial Strategy. And so today I thought I'd bring you a tidbit of what I teach in that class by telling you about thinking like an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurial strategy is about trying to understand why do some startups do very well and others do not. And one way you kind of start thinking about that is by, for example, asking investors what characteristics really define whether they want to invest into a company or not. And when you ask venture capitalists, for example, the top category by far is the founder. The founder more than the team, more founder and the team more than the product, the market, the sort of technology. It is the people making the startup, and so you wonder what is it about the founder that really makes a difference. And one person that thought a lot about that was Sam Altman before OpenAI. He was president of Y Combinator. And sort of he says, another question we get all the time is, what makes a really great founder? He says, there are two phrases that come to mind if I were trying to pick what our top 10 most successful founders would have said when we were interviewing them. I always figure it out and I never give up. And everybody thinks it is about how smart they are or their domain expertise or their networks connections. But it really is this kind of personality trait that spirit is the most important factor in successful founders. And so what is it and what do we know about these personality trait, about these way entrepreneurs approach problems that is sort of systematic, that can help us understand what it's like to think like an entrepreneur. And so I thought I'd bring you a couple of kind of things that are actually known about this that you might find helpful. So to do that, I'm going to tell you about two studies. The first happens at the Cambridge Innovation Center. The Cambridge Innovation Center is in Kendall Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it has sort of a lot of startups, and it gives access to different sort of actors in the startup scene that together allow really sort of pinpointing the differences between founders or not. Because it allows comparing founders to other employees of startups, to people that are working on the innovation of a startup that are not founders themselves, and even CEOs that are running startups but that did not initially found them. And the first thing that they find is that founders have a strong preference for risk. This is the case when they ask them how much do they typically enjoy taking risk, how much do they typically enjoy taking financial risk, and even when you do these rebuild choices where you give different lotteries, founders end up taking the risky choice. And so even when if faced with the same odds of different choices, entrepreneurs typically end up choosing things that are more riskier. Second, they go and look through what's called Big Five personality, which is about the way you relate to your environment. And so first they look at conscientiousness, at openness. And openness, founders do end up higher. They're more excited when a new opportunity comes along, something else is happening, to just engage with that and sort of see if that can be interesting. Then they look at conscientiousness, which is sort of how thorough you are with your own work when you're doing this. No difference. Extroversion, are you excited when you talk to others, or you feel more sort of wiped out by meeting other people? No difference. And agreeableness, do you put your needs first or you put your needs of others first? Also no difference. And this is sort of, these three in the middle, there's a second pattern we see when we look at founders, also quite validated by practitioners, which is that even though founders take risk and are open, if you think they're sort of more introverted, more extroverted, more sort of detailed-oriented or not, that turns out you shouldn't over-index on that. That it turns out to not be that important. I often think of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, both extremely successful, close competitors, very different personality in these dimensions. The next one is neuroticism. Neuroticism is sort of how affected you are by negative events. Maybe you got passed on a promotion, maybe you met a customer and it didn't work out, maybe you did a pitch and things didn't work out. And some people, they're sort of down on themselves when these things don't work out. Other people can move through that relatively quickly. Founders sort of have lower neuroticism, meaning they can move through these things quite quickly. They don't get hung up emotionally by that. Next thing, this is also consistent with Ben Horowitz's take, which he says, building a company, you make a lot of mistakes. Those mistakes are extremely damaging. You feel terrible about it because you hired all these people, you sold them on this great idea, then you make a mistake and everybody gets hurt. And if you're not, he says, and if you've not kind of been in a position like that, it can be highly psychologically challenging, kind of emphasizing it is about kind of moving through to these failures as well. Finally, they also look at how overconfident founders are. And I'll tell you the 3 variables that they look at very quickly. First is called self-efficacy. Do I believe I have sort of the skills to do the tasks necessary to do what's ahead of me? And of course, founders are huge outliers. Their entrepreneurs really believe they can get it done. Second, there's something called locus of control. Even if I believe I have the skills, do I believe actually the world depends on my choices? Or, for example, I grew up Catholic, and where I grew up, even though I might have the skills, a lot of the outcomes would depend on things outside of my control, God will provide, etc. Founders believe the world really depends on their own sort of choices. They'll get what they put out, and they also have high need for achievement. And so that's the first space. It tells you a lot about founders, but it doesn't touch it on one thing that is often kind of quite salient, that perhaps connects closer to that initial Sam Altman statement, which was founders are also sort of optimistic, right? They kind of just assume things are going to go well. And so to do that, a different team looked at something called the Survey of Consumer Finances. The Survey of Consumer Finances was administered by the census to look at financial decision-making. But one of the things that they ask is about how long do you expect you will live, right? And it turns out that, they use the measure where people overestimate their expectation of how long they will live. In general, people overestimate that significantly, but founders tend to overestimate that even more. They just seem more optimistic about things. In fact, I believe that the result is here. 7% of the population expects to live to 100, even though 0.03 actually does. Anybody here expect to live to 100? There we go. I expect to live to 100, and I don't know why. I don't make better health choices than anybody. My parents sort of normal health, but somehow it's just going to work out. And so, they find there's sort of a level of prudent optimism where people, they're not irrationally optimistic. They're not just betting the money in the casino and hoping things work out, but they have a certain positive expectation as things come through that actually allows kind of things to move forward, especially when facing significant uncertainty. Entrepreneurs are optimists. 18% expect to live to 90 years old, and in part that comes through better choices. In particular, the way optimism supports founders is that, think about it, you might think, by the way, if you were here at your MBA, that actually optimism should be bad for you, right? Optimism, like a lot of your discounted cash flows that you learn, a lot of your sort of all that Excel work, etc., was about, you might say, learning to be a realist, right? Learning to see things as they are rather than some rosy picture. And so if you were only coming at it that way, then optimism would be mostly distortionary. But when you're facing some long-term uncertain choice, expecting things to work out actually allows you to put more in. For example, they make better health choices. Why? Because if I'm expecting I'm going to live a long time, then it really matters that I have a good health. Why invest in education? Well, because I think it's going to pay off over the future. And that also comes down to the effort that they put into their company. So optimism motivates, that's the first thing we know, especially when things are uncertain. When you don't know if something's going to have a 5% probability of success, the expecting it to be a little bit better actually supports you in being able to put in the work because that's sort of a higher return to your effort. The second thing about optimism is that even if behaving optimistically, even if you weren't, turns out to be helpful. And the reason is that imagine you're a rational investor and you get the choice to invest in a realistic entrepreneur that tells you, I'm here and I recognize that 6 out of 7 startups fail in 5 years. I'm no particularly special person, so that's, would you like to place a bet in this company? It seems unexciting, right? Whereas somebody that is optimistic and says, I hear the statistics, but I think this is going to work, and here's some reasons, etc. would make you more willing to invest in that. And so even if you're acting as a rational investor, you kind of want to invest in that optimistic founder. If you're joining a startup, same thing, right? You want to kind of join that optimistic founder. And so kind of behaving optimistically actually allows you to attract the resources that actually allow you to in turn succeed. Do we see that kind of sequencing? And so in that sense, that kind of brings us back to Sam Altman and sort of what he called determination. I always figure it out. Some people also call that tenacity, just kind of a willingness to keep pushing through as things kind of come up. We can sort of make sense that it's supported in part by this willingness to kind of maintain a relatively positive outlook on the future, as well as some of the other characteristics that I showed you. And so all I wanted to do was tell you a little bit about what we're teaching nowadays, and a little bit about how the science and psychology of entrepreneurs actually connect to those sort of statements that you hear in practice, to understand why some startups really succeed while others that look observably similar beforehand do not. Thank you very much.